Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, depending on where in the world you're joining today's webinar from. And allow me to welcome you to this month's Next Level Purchasing Association Members Only webinar. My name is Charles Dominic. I am the President and Chief Procurement Officer of the Next Level Purchasing Association, and I will also be your presenter for today. And I'm very excited about that. So we're going to get started in just a moment. One thing that I do want to mention is that for those of you who are either SPSM certified or enrolled in the SPSM certification program or enrolled in our All Access plan, the slides from today's webinar are available for you in the library section of the members area of the Next Level Purchasing Association website. They are available for you to download. For those of you who are not yet SPSM certified or enrolled in the SPSM certification program or enrolled in the All Access plan, I will be covering how you can get those slides and be a member of those programs later on in today's webinar. And hopefully you will like today's webinar enough to want a copy of these slides. I think these are going to be some very helpful tips in today's webinar. This webinar is called Tips for Writing Better RFPs. So we are going to get started now, and I just want to cover our agenda for this morning. We're going to start off with RFP Writing Goals. And these goals are very few, very simple, but very, very important. And we're going to talk about the couple of goals that you need to have when writing an RFP. We're going to talk about the consequences of a bad RFP. If you're not sure how much effort to put into an RFP or making your RFP great, you need to know what's going to happen if your RFP is less than stellar. So we're going to cover those first, and hopefully those will inspire you to be a great RFP writer and put out the best quality RFPs so that you don't face these consequences. After we talk about the consequences of a bad RFP, we will talk about the 10 critical ingredients of a good RFP. We're going to talk about some common disclaimers that are included in many organizations' RFPs. My favorite section will be this one, the RFP writing mistakes. There are a lot of mistakes being made in RFPs daily. There's probably 1,000 mistakes being made on RFPs right as we speak here today. So I'm going to share with you what those are and how to avoid those. And then finally, we will have some final thoughts and a question and answer session. So we'll cover those at that time. Alrighty, let's get started with our first topic, and that is RFP writing goals. Goal number 1, and it's big. I don't want you to miss these goals. So they're in the biggest font that I could fit here on the screen. Goal number 1 is you want to maximize competition. When you are writing your RFP, you are not hoping, or you should not be hoping, that only a couple suppliers respond and make it easy for you to figure out which supplier to choose. You know, if you get, some people might get excited. Oh, there's only 2 suppliers. That makes it easy for me to pick what the best one is. That is not the goal of an RFP, because if you send your RFP to 10 suppliers and only 2 respond, chances are your decision-making methodology would be described as choosing the lesser of 2 evils. You don't want to be in a situation where you say, well, let's just choose the one that isn't the worst. You want the organization that is the best fit for you. And to get that, you want to have all of your options on the table. Your organization deserves to be able to select from all of its options. You don't want to write an RFP so bad that you limit your options. You want to maximize competition. When you have maximum competition, suppliers will provide more aggressive pricing and more attractive terms. If there's not as much competition, you will be less likely to get the best deal possible. All right, that's goal number one. Goal number two is you want your best fit suppliers to respond. Now, maybe when you send out an RFP to 10 suppliers, you might not get all 10 suppliers. You want the majority of them, but even more importantly, you want your best fit suppliers to respond. You may already have a feel for a couple of the suppliers that are the leaders in their field, or that you think would be the best fit for your organization. You don't want to scare those suppliers away. You want to make sure that they respond, because even if you get a couple of responses, and the fact that the best potential suppliers don't respond means that you won't be getting the best situation for your organization. You want your best fit suppliers to respond. You don't want the RFP to scare them away. You don't want to have the attitude, well, if they can't respond to my RFP, then they don't deserve my business. You don't want to have that attitude. You want the best solution for your organization, and you don't want to scare anyone away. So those are the two big RFP writing goals. You want to maximize competition. You want best fit suppliers to respond. So if we're talking about writing RFPs, writing better RFPs, then there has to be a such thing as worse RFPs. And if you have an RFP that is not optimal, so what? Well, I'll tell you so what. There are many consequences if your RFP is not written in accordance with the best practices you'll learn today. You will get proposals that are too dissimilar to fairly compare. If you are writing your RFP and trying to describe to your suppliers what work you want done or what product you want, you want them to be able to have enough specificity to allow you to compare what your options are. If you're lazy or your organization is lazy, you might have a specification or a statement of work that is unclear. And then you get some proposals that will probably not work for you, some proposals that probably will work, and some proposals that you're just not sure about. You need to make sure that your RFP is written in a way that you know what you want, or you have a good idea of what you want. You have to apply some level of thinking. Don't let your suppliers do all of your thinking for you. Know somewhat what you want, and that will make it easier to fairly compare suppliers. I'm not saying you have to write out your specification so that there's no room for supplier input. It's good to have supplier input in a lot of situations. I'm talking about those situations where, you can't even, you want a certain color of something, but you don't even specify it. Or you need an item that fits in a certain space, but you don't specify it. Another consequence of a bad RFP is supplier performance that fails to meet expectations. I've been involved in procurement for over 20 years, so I've seen hundreds, maybe even thousands of supplier performance failures in the field. And when you look at the root cause of a lot of these supplier failures, oftentimes you can trace it back to a bad RFP. A supplier performance failed to meet expectations, but those expectations were never delineated in a purchase order, or even before that in an RFP. You need to communicate your expectations to your suppliers in order for them to meet them. Otherwise, suppliers are only going to try to meet the expectations that you've officially published to them. And it's unfair to say to a supplier, well, we're not going to pay you because you didn't meet expectations, but nowhere in the world were those expectations ever documented. So it's important as early as the RFP to communicate your expectations to the supplier. Certainly then, if the supplier fails to meet the expectations on which they based their pricing, on which they accepted your purchase order or contract, you have a legitimate beef with the supplier. But if you go back to the RFP and the pricing on which your supplier or the specifications on which your supplier prepared its pricing weren't clear, then you really have to accept the blame for that. Another consequence of bad RFP is additional fees that surprise you later. Again, being in procurement 20 years, one of the most frustrating things, especially early on in my career, when I didn't know how to prevent against these additional fees, these surprise hidden fees, was the existence of these fees, the billing of these fees that I had to go back to the supplier, or people that I know now have to go back to the suppliers and say, hey, you never told us about these fees. And a lot of times when you have that type of situation, the supplier will say, you never told us that we had to provide these additional products or perform these additional services. And that's what gets you into trouble. The supplier can only price what they know you want. And if you communicate one thing to your supplier in the RFP, and then as they start working for you, you say, well, actually, we wanted something additional to that. Well, you're likely to run into an additional cost for that. You should think things through. Your organization should think things through and make sure that you describe everything you're going to be expecting later on. In a worst case scenario, here's what happens. You have your RFP, you have a bunch of suppliers who respond to it. You decide that your selection methodology will be to select the lowest bidder. You start working with the lowest bidder. And then because you're asking for some other things that you didn't really spell out in your RFP, you realize that the supplier is going to charge you more than what they responded to in the bid. And you're saying, hey, you bid a certain price, and that was the low bid. That's why we selected you. You have to honor it. And the supplier will say, well, we bid a price that was in accordance with what your requirements were. Now your requirements are more robust, so we have to increase our cost. Then you'd say, well, you might not be the low bidder anymore. But even if you went back to the second bidder, then you'd have to share the additional things that you'd need with them, and they may increase their cost. And then before you know it, you're doing a whole new RFP because you didn't get it right the first time. So it's important to get it right the first time, and if you do, you won't have those additional fees that surprise you later. You will realize if there is a change of scope to reasonably expect additional costs. And it'd be nice if you thought about possibilities of what a larger scope would look like and ask the supplier in the RFP, if we add this to the scope, how much would that cost? Tell us what your base price is, but if we decide to add this other component of the deal to it, how much will that cost? That'll avoid surprises later, because so many times a supplier will come in with a low price just to get the business, and then everything that you add on, because they know they have a captive audience, will be priced at full price or at a premium because it's too inconvenient for you to change. So those are some consequences of a bad RFP. So now let's talk about a good RFP and what it includes. And what I'm going to share with you now are 10 ingredients of a good RFP. Number one, an overview of the intended purchase. So this is different than the specifications. These are not step-by-step instructions or drawings or anything like that. This tells you how the product or service you're buying fits into what your organization is doing. It may talk about the environment in which a product will be used, or the environment in which a service will be performed, or what you're trying to accomplish by buying that product or buying that service, just to provide some context for the suppliers. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. One of which is that sometimes your statement of work or your specification can actually conflict with the overview of the intended purchase. You know, you're intending the product to be used in a situation that's not appropriate for the product, and that's a great time for the supplier to come back and educate you. So that's a great place to start, an overview of the intended purchase. Number two is your specification or your statement of work, and this is where the details are. This is describing to a T the product that you're buying or the services that you want performed for you. So it's important to get this right, get it to be accurate, get it to be complete. Now, what's the ideal length of a specification? Or do you have a template for a specification? And the answer to what's the ideal length is it depends. And no, we don't have a template because every product or service is likely to be different. A specification can be as simple as a part number, or it can be as complex as an 80-page document with engineering drawings. The key is that your specification or your statement of work, and I'll use those terms interchangeably today, they have to be able to completely and accurately communicate to the supplier what you want to purchase. And if a part number tells the supplier all they need to know, then that's all you need. But in some cases where something is truly custom, you may need that dozen or hundreds of page specification. But it just has to be able to clearly, completely, and accurately communicate to the supplier what it is you want to buy. Number three is an indication whether or not deviations from the technical specifications will be considered. So anytime you issue a specification statement of work RFP to suppliers, there is a chance that a supplier will want to propose something a little bit different than you've specified. Sometimes that's okay, sometimes it's not. But you should indicate in every RFP whether or not deviations from the technical specifications will be considered. First of all, if the supplier proposes differences or deviations, you want to know about it. You don't want to find out after you sign a contract that things are a little different than what you'd expect. You want to know about it. In some cases, it is impossible, technically impossible, to accept anything else that doesn't comply. But it's also good if you can accept deviations to say that you can, because oftentimes, you know, suppliers are creating new products, or suppliers are the real experts in the industry related to that product or that service that you want to buy, and they may be able to bring value-added suggestions and say it would make more sense if you bought product B instead of product A. And so it's important in your RFP to make it clear whether you welcome that or not. Number four is your estimated quantity to be purchased. Very important. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later when we talk about the mistakes in RFPs. So, you know, it's important because for a number of reasons. First of all, a supplier may not be able to provide a huge quantity. If you're a large consumer and they're a small supplier, they may not be able to have the capacity to fulfill your order if it's too big. Also, price breaks come into play. The more you buy, the lower the unit price, right? That's why, you know, things are so cheap at Costco, but you might have to buy 50 rolls of paper towels to get that 25-cent per roll cost. So it's important. Also, if you're having something custom made for you, when you have something custom made, the supplier has a lot of non-recurring costs. So whether they're, for example, printing one T-shirt or printing 10,000 t-shirts. There's some non-recurring setup that has to happen, and there's a cost to that. They need to know how many units to spread those non-recurring costs out over. Then there's terms and conditions, and I always recommend including your terms and conditions in your RFP. A few reasons for this. First of all, let's talk about negotiation. Too often what happens when a poorly constructed RFP process is run is that you don't include the terms and conditions in your RFP. You identify your preferred supplier. You say, Mr. Supplier, we want to do business with you, and by the way, here's our terms and conditions. Well, if the supplier knows that they provided the most attractive proposal, they know that you're going to select them, and you've probably done all the work necessary to select them already, then they may feel a bit of certainty about getting your business, and they may push back on some of those terms and conditions. You don't want to negotiate in that situation. You have less leverage at that time. When you have the most leverage is when you have the most suppliers competing for your business. So you want to make your terms and conditions known up front and have the suppliers acknowledge that they will agree to those terms and conditions if they are selected. When you have those up front, then the supplier has no turning back. You know, it's like, hey, you based your price on this, said we're going to accept it if you're chosen, and that's the time to take advantage of your leverage. Another thing that happens is, you know, let's face it, some terms and conditions of purchasing organizations have costs to the suppliers to comply with them, and they will be factored in your price. So if you want a price and you don't include terms and conditions, and you get a price, and then later say, here are the terms and conditions, well, the supplier may need to revise their price if you have some really onerous terms and conditions. So have those up front, get the suppliers to agree to them while you're still competing, they're still competing for your business, and you don't have to have that separate negotiation later that can drag on for weeks after you've already determined who the best bidder will be. Get that out of the way. Don't make sure that the suppliers know what the terms and conditions are, know that they are conditioned for their bid being accepted, and you won't have that delay causing negotiation later. Number 6, specify your selection criteria. In other words, what factors are you evaluating about suppliers and their proposals? It's important for suppliers to know that. Otherwise, they don't know necessarily what information to share with you to help you make a decision about their capabilities. You know, if you're evaluating years of experience, for example, tell them. If you're evaluating risk based on, let's say, the Altman Z-score, which is a measure of financial performance, let them know that so they can provide any information that will be helpful to support you understanding what their capabilities are. Number 7 is summary of supplier information requested. So near the end of your RFP document, list all in one place a summary of everything you're expecting to receive from suppliers. Too often, you see 40-page RFPs, and on page 3, it tells the supplier one thing to submit, and page 6 of the RFP tells them something else to submit, and page 30 of the RFP tells them to submit something else. And you're relying on the suppliers to make sure that they catch all of those things in a 40-page RFP. Exercise some professional writing here. Summarize what you need all in one place so the supplier can go down a checklist on a single page and know exactly what they need to submit. Because what you'll end up doing is if a supplier who might be the perfect supplier for you forgets or overlooks a requirement to submit something that's buried in the middle of the RFP, you know, depending on how your RFP is written, you may be forced to disqualify that supplier. And it's really, you know, yeah, I guess you could say it's kind of the supplier's fault for missing something, but really it's kind of your fault because you as a procurement professional should be just that, professional. And you should write professionally, which means providing a summary of what you want the supplier to submit. Number 8 is a deadline for proposal submission, very important. Number 9 is method of proposal delivery, whether you want hard copies, whether you want email, etc. You know, despite it being 2016, I still see people who want 6 binders sent in response to their RFPs and so forth. Come on, folks. You know, email is not a new thing. The least you could do is accept proposals by email so they're easier to save, they're easier to distribute, things like that. You know, be realistic here. And then finally is a response form, and I highly recommend that you include a response form in your RFPs. And that is if you don't use an e-sourcing system. E-sourcing systems are great. They will help you. They will have specific places for each a supplier to respond to each question or request for information. Attachments can be uploaded, things like that. Oh, it keeps things so simple. But if you're still getting proposals emailed to you, include a response form for a couple reasons. First of all, it makes things easier for you to analyze if there is a standard thing that you're looking at. You know, you don't want to look at one supplier's proposal and all the information that you need is in one place, and then look at another supplier's proposal, and you got to get something from this page and something from that page, etc., and cobble it together yourself. Having a standardized response form makes that easier for you. Also helps to make sure that suppliers don't miss things that they're supposed to respond to. So those were the critical ingredients for a good RFP. Now I'm going to talk about some common RFP disclaimers. In a lot of RFPs, you see these types of disclaimers, and I'm guessing that they came about the same way that the word hot on restaurants' coffee cups came to be. And that is, there was a problem. That problem led to a lawsuit, and despite the obvious nature of something like someone spilling hot coffee in their lap, there was still a lawsuit that kind of changed the industry so that other people don't get sued. And that may be how these RFP disclaimers came into play. And I'll just cover some of the ones we typically see. The RFP is not an offer or a contract. You want to make sure that the supplier knows that this document that they have in front of them is not an authorization to start work that they're going to bill for. It's not an offer or a contract. It's a request for proposal. Proposals become your organization's property. Bidders will not be compensated or reimbursed for costs incurred in preparing proposals. This isn't a consulting assignment. You're not asking them to write a proposal for you because you need a proposal. You're asking for it so you can consider their business. It's not something that they're doing for you as a service. Your organization is not obligated to contract for any of the products or services described in the RFP, and your organization reserves the rights to accept or reject any or all proposals, waive any anomalies in proposals, or modify or cancel the RFP. All right. So let's move on from common RFP disclaimers to my favorite section of today's webinar, which is RFP writing mistakes. All right, first mistake we're going to talk about, not realizing that the supply base has become jaded. All right, so a lot of us assume that a supplier will receive an RFP from you, and they will get absolutely excited. Yay, we got an RFP. Oh, this is our big chance. We're going to make some money. Woo! sorry folks, the supply base has become jaded. They've seen too many RFPs that they lost. They've seen too many RFPs that basically serve to just justify continuing to do business with the incumbent, things like that. Most suppliers who receive RFPs probably think that there's a low probability that they'll win. So if you think that people will be excited to receive your RFP and you'll automatically get responses from every supplier you invite, you might be wrong, because the supply base is jaded. The supply base often thinks responding to RFPs is too much work for a low probability chance of winning. Be aware of that. Second RFP writing mistake is making the RFP too scary. Yes, an RFP can be scary. When a supplier receives a 40 to 80 page document that they have to respond to in 3 days, as some of you require, that's scary for them. That's a lot of work. Oh my gosh, that's going to be so much work to do. And I don't even know if we have a chance of winning the business. This is scary. I got to respond to this. I got to respond to that. I'll have to go to legal for agreement on this. I'll have to get this piece of information from finance. Yada, yada, yada. A lot of work. That can scare suppliers away. And remember, your goal is to maximize competition with the RFP, not eliminate it through having an RFP that's too scary. Make your RFP something welcoming to respond to. You don't have to ask for everything at once from every single supplier. See it as a process, and you want to be the one eliminating suppliers from competition. You don't want suppliers self-eliminating because your RFP looks too unprofessionally written. Next mistake is something called RFP spamming. And the first time I encountered this phrase was reading the book Managing Indirect Spend by my friends over at Source One Management Services. What this means is that you go and find the email addresses of suppliers and you just send RFPs out to them without contacting them personally. And you expect just that the fact that the RFP arrived in their inbox to be something that inspires them to respond. It's a bad practice. It gets very low response rate. It's lazy. You know, again, you want to maximize the number of suppliers that respond. You want to maximize your competition. You want to make sure that your best choice of suppliers out there are the ones responding. So don't RFP spam. You know, it can be very easy and not take a lot of time to call these suppliers. Have a conversation with their business development manager or the VP of sales, maybe if even their president if it's a small enough supplier. Let them know that you're going to be issuing an RFP. Ask them which email address to send it to. Help them feel like they will actually have a choice, a chance of winning. And then you will get a better chance to get a good response rate. You don't want them to see this RFP in their inbox, say they never talked to anyone there. There's probably not a chance that they're gonna win, so why bother? You want to entice them. You want them to feel like they might get lucky and win your business. So don't RFP spam. Another mistake is not making quantities clear. And I talked about this a little bit already, so I won't talk about it a whole lot here. I'll just touch on it for a minute or two. I know in our business, which is training and certification, we see a lot of problems with quantities in the RFPs that we receive. You know, for example, we provide on-site negotiation training. We can come to your facility, train your procurement team on negotiation. We can do that over 5 days. We can do it in 3 days, 2 days, 1 day, half a day, an hour. But our cost will depend on how much negotiation training you actually want. So tell us what you want. Tell us how many hours of training you're looking for. Or to put it in a product sense, tell your suppliers how many widgets you intend to buy. It's so important so that the supplier can price things accordingly. Another mistake is not being specific enough. You want your suppliers to have a pretty good idea of what it is that you're looking for so they can propose the right product or service at the right price. Here's an example for not being specific enough. Let's say a company was doing an RFP for software. And in their RFP, it states that the successful bidder's software must operate in multiple currencies or must support multiple currencies. Well, one of those suppliers may have a piece of software that supports, let's say, the Indian rupee and the British pound sterling. Well, that's certainly supporting multiple currencies, but what if your organization uses US dollars and euros? They're different currencies. So if you need specific currencies, ask for specific currencies. Don't be vague. So that's just one example of not being specific enough. Another RFP writing mistake is asking for irrelevant information, including when sourcing globally. Go through your RFP. I challenge you. Look at the next RFP you're about to send. And look at what you're asking for. And ask yourself, honestly, do you truly need the information that you're asking for? If not, eliminate it, because every extra sentence in an RFP makes it scarier and makes it less attractive to respond to. So get that irrelevant stuff out. And I included in this part, especially when, or including, but I'll change that verbally here to especially when sourcing globally. There's some things in your country that won't make sense to foreign suppliers and might be irrelevant anyway. For example, here in the United States, we have the Better Business Bureau, an iconic organization that is designed to help both consumers and businesses identify which suppliers are the good guys and which suppliers are the bad guys. So, you can ask a supplier, a U.S. supplier, what is your Better Business Bureau rating, and they will probably know what you're talking about. But if a U.S. company asks that of, say, an Indonesian supplier, they may have no idea what you're talking about, and they won't have a Better Business Bureau rating, making it essentially irrelevant. So watch for those things that are going to be irrelevant to your suppliers. Another RFP writing mistake is asking for too much at once. Again, you might be asking for things, like Better Business Bureau rating, number of employees, locations of facilities, your financial statements, your bank references, your customer references, things like that. And the more you ask for, the scarier your RFP is, the lower likelihood of response is. And think about it this way. Let's say you're asking for customer references and you get 10 suppliers who provide those. Are you actually going to call the 10th most attractive supplier's customers for a reference? No, you're not going to do that. That would be a waste of your time. So why ask everyone for it anyway? Look for those things. You don't have to ask for all of that at the RFP stage. If you tell a supplier, you are now on a short list, we've narrowed the field down from 10 to 2, we need your customer references if you want to stay in the competitive process, they're going to provide those to you probably at a moment's notice. And, maybe they wouldn't have in the competitive process. Because let's face it, from a sales side, you don't want every Tom, Dick, and Harry contacting your references. From the sales side, your references are your closest clients. The last thing you want to do is ruin that relationship. But think about if a supplier sent you a couple of people every day to call asking about them. You'd get tired of that pretty darn quickly, wouldn't you? Yeah, you would. And you might, that might affect how you feel about doing business with that supplier. It may harm your relationship. Suppliers don't want that to happen, so suppliers would be more comfortable giving their references once they know that there's a legitimate chance of them winning the business. So be aware of those things. If there's something you can defer, defer it. If there's something you can eliminate it, obviously eliminate it. Again, your goal is to maximize competition with the RFP. Once you have all of your responses, then you can kind of cut things down, pare things down. But before then, you don't want to be left with only the most desperate suppliers. All right. So that's asking too much at once. Another RFP writing mistake is specifying requirements that are unreasonable to require. So this happens a lot when you use RFP templates or terms and condition templates. And I talked about this a little bit in yesterday's edition of Perch Tips with the supplier onboarding process. So often what happens is that you look at requirements for your riskiest suppliers, and then you end up asking or placing those same requirements on all of your suppliers, even when the elevated risk isn't there. For example, certificate of insurance. So many procurement professionals blindly request certificates of insurance, and those certificates, they say those certificates of insurance must show that the supplier has so much insurance or certain limits of liability for all these different types of insurance. But if you take a construction supplier's insurance requirements and use those for a consultant, it's not going to fit. The consultant will not have the same types of insurance that a construction contractor will, or the high limits of liability that a construction contractor will. There's no need for it. And it'd be unreasonable to require that of suppliers. So be careful about specifying requirements that are unreasonable to require. They scare some suppliers away, and they compel other suppliers to build that into your cost and make it higher than it needs to be. Next is something I call requiring compliance with the unknown. For example, let's say that you say in your RFP, you, Mr. Supplier, must comply with our organization's supplier code of conduct. Well, if you don't provide the supplier code of conduct with the RFP, or at least provide a link to it, you're asking the supplier to comply with the unknown. They don't know what your supplier code of conduct says or any other vague requirement like that. So if you need them to comply with something, make sure you provide them with the rules that they need to comply with. Conflicts are something to avoid in RFPs. And this is where you address a topic in the RFP in 2 or more places, and it says something different in 2 or more places. For example, maybe in a 40-page RFP, on page 3, you'll say lead time should be 3 weeks, and on page 30, you were saying lead time should be 4 weeks. That's an example of a conflict. So watch out for those and make sure that there's no conflicts. And very closely related to conflicts is something called redundancies. And redundancies are situations where you have the same topic addressed in multiple places in your RFP. They might be consistent, but they say the same thing multiple times, and that's unnecessary. If you're specifying the lead time on page 3, no need to reiterate it on page 30. So watch out for redundancies, because when redundancies are used, oftentimes an RFP is used as a template for another RFP, and those redundancies in the first RFP can turn into the conflicts in the second RFP. Next RFP writing mistake is requesting free consulting more so than a proposal. You know, so many times with in procurement, we've gotten in the bad habit of using RFPs to essentially get free consulting from the supply base. For example, you know, I've seen something called a budgetary RFP. And to me, from a sales side, a budgetary RFP means that we have no intention of buying anything from you. We just want you to do the work of telling us what something would cost so that we know. And you know what? That is not very appealing for a supplier. Sophisticated suppliers can see right through that, and they're not going to respond. Why should they do the work for you? So be careful not to request free consulting more so than a proposal. Yeah, I mean, a lot of times it's a good procurement practice to do a two-step bidding process where you ask for technical specifications, and then those suppliers that have acceptable technical specifications will move on to the next step and be asked for pricing. But what suppliers don't want to do is write a specification in the guise of an RFP and for you to use that specification to send to all other suppliers to bid on. That's requesting free consulting. It's, in my mind, very unethical, and it's not a great way to build up relationships in the supply base. And then a final RFP writing mistake is imposing excessive costs or even pay to play. Now, pay to play is where you say, you know, if you want your proposal to be considered, you must include a check for $1,000, and if you pay the $1,000, we'll consider your proposal along with every other proposal that has come in with a $1,000 check. If you don't submit a check, you will not be considered. Now, this was common years ago in like the 2008, maybe around 2006, 2007. Not as popular now. I will mention it just so it continues to stay dead and buried, but it's a bad practice. You're not attracting the best suppliers that way. You're attracting the most desperate suppliers. And if you want to be a successful organization, you need the best fit suppliers, not the most desperate suppliers. Now, that's not the only way you can impose excessive cost. I mentioned certificates of insurance before. I've seen RFPs require that proposals include that the bidder include a certificate of insurance, documenting certain insurance, and naming the buying organization as an additional insured, even though there's a chance they won't be doing business. Ladies and gentlemen, you may not know this, but it costs money for a supplier to add you as an additional insured to their insurance policy. If there is something called a waiver of subrogation, that costs money to the buying organization. And unfortunately, I've seen too many procurement professionals be lazy and blind about this and just say, hey, our insurance department requires it. We'll require it in the RFP. So you're asking a supplier to buy more insurance than they currently carry, which is probably more insurance than they ever needed. You're asking them to pay money to add you as an additional insured just so that you can consider their proposal. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not the time to do it. You can include your terms and conditions that show what the insurance requirements will be if the supplier has to accept or is asked to accept your purchase order. But don't require every bidder to incur the costs, whether it be in insurance requirement or some other way. Make sure it doesn't cost the supplier money because that means that you are probably not going to get as many responses to your RFP. And remember that goal. The goal of the RFP is to maximize competition. You want to have control over which suppliers get eliminated from consideration. You don't want the suppliers to eliminate themselves over a little technicality like this. Okay, just some closing thoughts. I talked about big RFPs scaring suppliers away, and that scare factor also applies to supplier registration forms. It applies to purchase orders. It applies to any documents that stands between your interest and their acceptance. You know, just because your risk management department made up this requirement that you should ask for something on a supplier registration form doesn't mean you have to blindly follow it. Be a professional. Be a leader. Know how procurement works. Know what things affect supplier relationships. And if something doesn't make sense, bring that expertise to risk management, because it may not have been a hard requirement in the first place. They may relent. So you got to be the expert. Watch out for these things, your registration forms, purchase orders, RFPs, growing out of control and affecting how you deal with the supply base. Final thoughts. If you're going to err towards casting a net too wide than a net too small. You don't want to scare suppliers away at the RFP stage. You want to have all of the choices so you, as a super intelligent procurement professional, can make your choices of the best fit supplier. Don't scare those best suppliers away. And then entice suppliers. Make them feel like they have a chance to win. If a supplier feels that there is not a good chance for them to win, they won't respond. You're sending out an RFP because you want responses. Pick up the phone. Take a half of a morning or 2 hours or whatever to call your suppliers. Say, hey, we're going to be issuing an RFP soon. We're identifying candidates who may be interested in responding. Can we chat a few minutes about our requirements and your capabilities? Tell me a little bit about your company. That's all you got to do. Have conversations. That is what gets suppliers excited about RFPs instead of hitting the delete button in their email when they see that spam RFP come across. Okay, that concludes part one of today's webinar. Now we can move into the second part where you get to ask your questions and I will answer them. So please turn your attention to the corner of your WebEx console. There you will see a Q&A section with a space to type your question. When you hit the send button, that question will come to me. I will read it aloud here and answer it live on today's webinar. So now's the time to ask your questions. We have, let's see, about 6 minutes to answer questions. So while some questions are rolling in, one of the common questions that I address as soon as I start the webinar, but still get questions about it throughout the webinar, is how can I get the slides from today's webinar? Well, we take care of certified SPSMs here at the Next Level Purchasing Association. You are valuable, valuable people, and we want to make sure you get the best service, the best treatment possible from us. So if you have the SPSM certification, you have access to the slides from today's webinar, as well as almost every webinar we've done for the last, 5+ years. Just log into the Next Level Purchasing Association website using your username and password, navigate over to the library tab, and there you'll get a link to the slides from today's webinar. Also, if you're in the SPSM certification program or the All Access plan, you also have access to the slides. I'm going to quickly go through those two programs and compare them as far as what you will get. Under the SPSM certification program, again, you will get the slides from today's webinar as well as the slides from most of the webinars we've done. You'll also get on-demand replays of today's webinar and previous webinars as well if you're in the SPSM certification program or if you sign up for it. In addition, you'll also get a host of really cool templates and sample documents, such as an RFP template, a cost savings reporting template, things like that. A lot of great templates, and we're always adding to those templates. You'll get transcriptions from interviews with procurement experts. You'll have access to 6 online courses, and you'll be eligible to work to meet the requirements of the first level in the SPSM family of certifications, which is the SPSM. The cost of enrolling in the SPSM certification program is $1,159 per person. And if you need more information on that or group discounts, there's a phone number and an email address on the bottom of your screen. Also, another way of getting slides from today is if you have our All Access plan, and that is like the SPSM certification program on steroids. It's like you'll also get slides from today's webinar and multiple webinars we've done in the past. You'll get the on-demand replays of those webinars. You'll get all those cool templates. You'll get the transcriptions from interviews with procurement experts. You'll have access to all 42 of our online courses. That's up to over 150 hours of online procurement training at your fingertips. And you'll be eligible to complete the requirements for all 3 levels of certification in the SPSM family of certifications, the SPSM, the higher level SPSM 2, and the highest level SPSM 3. Cost of that is $21.99 per person. And again, you can contact us if you need group discounts, etc. All right, some questions have rolled in. Let me answer those. And something comes in from Ashraf Taha, simply says hi, and hello to you, Ashraf Taha. Thanks for joining us today. Rhoda Lewis, early on in the webinar, asked, will this be recorded and available after the presentation? Yes, Rhoda, this is being recorded. And again, if you are SPSM certified, enrolled in the SPSM certification program, or enrolled in our All Access plan, you will have access to it. Usually, we have those up within a couple of days. If you're not enrolled in those programs, we would love to have you. And as you can see, you get a heck of a lot of value by enrolling. Paul Aravallo asks, what is the ideal minimum? And I'm not sure ideal minimum what, Paul, but let me assume you're talking about number of suppliers to invite to respond to your RFP. You know, if you have 2 suppliers that provide bids, you have competition. And a lot of times that is enough competition to get a pretty good deal. But I don't like to recommend a minimum or say that a certain number is ideal, because in every market it may be different. And just because you invite 2 or 3 suppliers to bid doesn't mean all 2 or 3 will bid. I recommend, you know, having as many suppliers as you can identify that might be qualified. Certainly, you know, you may want to do some pre-qualification. If there's 20 suppliers that seem to be good, you know, then you might want to pare it down to the suppliers that you know do business with your competitors or are innovative, or if location is important, that have a location near you, or if multiple locations are important, locations in other countries, whatever. So it's hard to say for every situation. But, you know, I think that in general, procurement professionals tend to be a little bit too lazy and not invite enough suppliers, thinking that maybe 2 or 3 is enough. Paul had actually clarified that later on down the road, minimum number of proponents to respond to the RFP. Well, again, you need a minimum of 2 respondents to have competition. Ideally, you'll shoot for more than that if that particular market supports that. Early on, Patricia Garcia asked, can we get the PowerPoint for this event via email? Again, it's available in the NLPA library if you are SPSM certified, enrolled in the SPSM certification, or enrolled in the All Access plan. If not, I hope you do enroll and join thousands of procurement professionals who are enjoying these benefits. Another question. Wow. Renata Sokoloska asks, this is early on. Could I get a link to a recorded seminar after it finishes? What you see on your screen is how you have access to that. Michelle Kelly asks, do you have a sample RFP response form that you can share? I don't think we have one, again, because every person will be looking, or every situation may involve a different set of information that you're requiring. But, you know, if I had to describe it so you could visualize it, you want the suppliers, at a minimum, you want the supplier's name, you want the supplier's contact information, you want the supplier's price, and you probably want an acknowledgement that the supplier agrees to your terms and conditions, or will accept your terms and conditions if awarded the business. That is if you followed my instructions for including your terms and conditions in the RFP. So it can be as simple as a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet could grow depending on how complex the RFP is. Deborah Messina asks, can an RFP be too long? What is the recommended length? Have you heard of utilize the RFP software EC sourcing / Flex RFP? What is your opinion of the software? I currently use this software. I'm not familiar with EC sourcing. Can an RFP be too long? Absolutely. The recommended length is for you to decide, to go through and ask yourself, is this question relevant? If not, eliminate it. Or ask yourself, is this question necessary right now from every supplier, or can I ask a handful of suppliers later? If it's later, ask them later. So it can be too long. Most RFPs are, and there are consequences to that. Julio Garcia asks, says great content today. One question, then asks, how do you make your stakeholder commit with good RFPs, especially the technical data or statement of work? Can you go back to the slide of consequences of bad RFPs? Sure. Let me go back to that slide. That's far back there, but we will get there. Consequences of bad RFP, yes, you can tell them these things later. And if you have your own stories to share, say, you know what, stakeholder in finance department, I worked with our engineering department on an RFP a year ago and learned some valuable lessons. Here's what we fail. Here's how we came up short with that RFP. The technical side was not complete. As a result, we ended up paying additional fees later. We ended up realizing we selected the wrong supplier, things like that. It's better to get things right than to fix things later. And that's kind of the message that you want to send. You know, showcase your experience that you know, this is not your first RFP. Illustrate some problems that have happened, or if you haven't had problems happen, talk about the things that I talked about today. And then say it's better to get things right at the beginning than to fix things later. So yes. Yul Ruiz asks, do you have a template for RFPs? Yes, we do. We have one in the NLPA library. And again, you have access to the library the same way you get access to the slides. Bree Davis asks, question on T's and C's at solicitation level. Do you incorporate all of your T's and C's? I call them provisions and only incorporate the most pertinent at the time of solicitations. What's your thought on T's and C's at both solicitation and award? Great question, Bree. My thoughts are, if you're going to ask them to agree to them later, include them in the RFP. Don't hold back anything for later, that only causes problems, that only causes a second negotiation to pop up. Keep it clean for a couple of reasons. You have the most leverage if you include those provisions in your RFP, and you save time later. Don't mess around. Get them in your RFP. All right, next question comes from Bill Bittner. Bill asks, we often put a milestone on our timeline of when we will announce the selected vendor and finish the contract after. How do you balance announcing a winner, but then keeping competition after they are announced while finishing the contract? Bill, the easiest question to answer for that is don't announce the selected vendor. You are in control. It should be a policy that you never announce a selected vendor until the ink is dry on the contract. It's a mistake to do otherwise. So that is a practice that you may need to change. Wes Rhodes writes, Charles, I do not have any questions, but thank you for providing this webinar. Very helpful. And it looks like we're pretty much out of time. Still a lot of questions that are there. I am going to try to save these questions and do my best to somehow address them. Oh my goodness, there's a ton of questions. This was great. Maybe we'll do another webinar in the future just handling these questions, because this is honestly a record for the number of questions. Hopefully these questions will be saved. I apologize that we're out of time today. Honestly, looking through these, it would probably take at least an hour and a half just to answer the questions. So I apologize we're out of time. I'm going to do my best to have some way of answering these questions, whether on the networking tab in the members area, the Next Level Purchasing Association website, maybe in a future article, maybe in another webinar. I love that there's been this much feedback. We've had a great crowd today, huge crowd today. So thank you all very much for attending. We're wrapping things up for today. This is Charles Dominic from the Next Level Purchasing Association saying I hope to see you all on a future Next Level Purchasing Association webinar. Good day, everyone.